Welcome to Invisibly Unwell. I'm your host, Paige Lavelle. I've spent the past 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. I've worked hard to get where I am professionally, but there's a side of me that few are aware of. I am also an autoimmune warrior, an eating disorder survivor, an author, and now a podcast host. My goal here is to educate and empower high-achieving women navigating autoimmune conditions and other chronic illnesses, who at the same time are also dealing with challenges that all high-achieving women face, like disordered eating, perfectionism, and people-pleasing. Invisibly Unwell is what I wish I had at the start of my journey. You are not alone. I hope my story and the stories and expertise of my guests will provide you with knowledge and ideas and empower you to share your own story and advocate for the life you've worked so hard to build. Quick disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Today's guest is Alexa Prass, a registered dietitian who wanted to become a dietitian after being diagnosed with celiac disease. She had to radically change her own diet to support her own health over a decade ago. Since then, she's completed a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Public Health in Nutrition and Dietetics. Her true passion, and why she got into nutrition and dietetics, is supporting those needing a gluten-free diet. Living with a dietary restriction, such as gluten-free diet for celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, is very challenging and can take a toll mentally as well. She combines her lived experience with professional education to support people in truly understanding their gluten-free needs, understanding their new diagnosis, and how to move forward living their best life while also managing a chronic condition. Alexa truly believes with the right knowledge and support system, living gluten-free doesn't have to hold you back. I really wanted to have Alexa on the podcast because I have gone on and off gluten myself several times. There is evidence to show that removing gluten from your diet is helpful with the symptoms for Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and it has helped me, but I also don't have celiac disease, and I have a history of disordered eating, as I know many listeners can relate to. So when I could manage a gluten-free diet in a healthy manner, I was able to. However, when I couldn't, I had to reincorporate gluten into my diet and did so with the supervision of a dietitian and my primary care physician. I wanted to make sure the show's inclusive of those with celiac because a lot of us, there's trends out there. Go off gluten, go off dairy, do this, do that. And there's a lot to be said around how that is excessively restrictive for those who might not have an allergy. However, there is a population that has celiac disease, and I want to make sure when I'm sharing these invisible chronic illnesses that people deal with, that those individuals are accounted for. And I really love how Alexa makes the topic approachable. She doesn't demonize anyone for struggling with making these changes to their diet and their lifestyle and the impact that it has at the outset. I know if you have gluten sensitivity, or especially if you have celiac disease, you will feel like you can relate to her story today. Okay, welcome to the show, Alexa Prass. I'm so excited to have you here today. And I would just love if you could tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your work, and then we can just keep the conversation going from there.
Yeah, so I work as a dietitian. Currently, I work as a clinical dietitian at a hospital, but my journey to dietetics was really informed by my diagnosis of celiac disease. So long term, I want to work with people with celiac disease because it is an autoimmune disease where the only treatment option is the gluten-free diet. So when I was younger and starting to learn more about the gluten-free diet and just talking with people about it, I was like, I'd never known that you could be a dietitian or like work in nutrition. It was never really a job description, or like a job just generally that people talked about or like, and told me about, you know, like career fairs and all those things. So I was like, oh wait, like you can do this as a job. Like you can talk to people about food and nutrition. So I kind of pivoted and turned and I was like, I want to help people. Like at first I was like very resistant to my diagnosis and everything that comes with it. But then eventually after taking some time and like, you know, learning how to manage it myself, I was like, I can use this to help people, and sharing my experience. And so I'm working on trying to start, offering more support for people in the celiac and gluten-free community, as a dietitian. It's a little slow going, but we're getting there. So this is one of those fun first steps is,
Yeah.
just
You're making an
talking.
effort, which is
Yes,
the most that you can ask for right now. Um,
exactly.
yeah. So to provide a little clarity for someone who might not be familiar, gluten-free has become a bit of a trend in the last few years, to put it mildly. So I've gone on and off of a gluten-free diet because I don't have celiac, but I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So there's certain research to show that reducing or eliminating gluten is really helpful. I have something else I share on the show. I have a history, as do many, many, many women that I know and friends, family, people I've worked with, a history of disordered behavior with food and the way they approach it. So that's something I definitely want to dig into farther with you because I know that's something that you speak to. But for clarity around celiac itself, could you explain the difference between people that might be gluten sensitive versus, or might see some benefit to eliminating or reducing gluten consumption versus what actual celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition?
Yeah, of course. That's definitely like a very common question. And like you said, the gluten-free industry is kind of very trendy. In the media, you see it all the time. So it can be really confusing. So for someone with celiac disease, so that, like you said, is an autoimmune disease, it's mostly related to like your small intestines and your digestive system. So when someone with celiac disease like ingests gluten, their body mounts a response, and then it attacks the healthy cells of your small intestine. So obviously things attacking your body are not good. So then you have all of these different types of reactions. And a lot of people know the gastrointestinal kind of symptoms that people are kind of aware of, like diarrhea, bloating, abdominal pain, constipation. But there's actually over 300 documented symptoms related to celiac disease. So some of these could be like neurological, like brain fog and headaches and migraines. Some people may have trouble with like fertility and some different lesser known symptoms that actually are related to celiac disease. So that can make it, even more challenging to get a diagnosis if you kind of have some of those symptoms that aren't, typically thought of with celiac disease when you first talk about it. And then like a gluten sensitivity or an intolerance or like the non-celiac gluten sensitivity, what it can be sometimes, or it's sometimes called, is honestly kind of a diagnosis of elimination. For people that may struggle and like notice that they have sensitivity to gluten, but they have been tested and don't have celiac. This is kind of just like an overall term that a doctor might give them or a diagnosis. So a lot of the symptoms are similar, and there's still a lot more research that needs to be done to really understand what is going on in those people. But definitely real, like obviously these people are having symptoms and reactions. So those people, definitely want to hold space for them and understand that whatever they're feeling is valid, and the gluten-free diet is hard, but if it gives them relief, that's really wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to hear, I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I will start with, I'd love to hear about your own diagnosis journey because I know celiac is I shouldn't say not the easiest because it's fairly straightforward to diagnose, but there are certain steps to actually truly get a celiac diagnosis. And I know sometimes, as you were saying, I did not know there were 300 symptoms. I was about to say that's crazy, but I feel like every autoimmune disease has lots of very obscure symptoms and things that you would never think, oh, this is caused by a root of an autoimmune condition. But we learn that as we go through the journey of obtaining a diagnosis. So would you be open to sharing just shedding a little bit of light on your particular diagnosis story and how you came to find you had celiac?
Yeah. So my diagnosis, it was interesting because my dad was diagnosed first. So with celiac, it is hereditary. So, if, someone in your family has it, you are at a higher, likelihood of having it. So my dad actually pretty much self-diagnosed. He was on and off different like low carb diets and would realize that he would feel a lot better when he wasn't eating a lot of carbohydrate rich foods. So breads and pastas and all these gluten, foods that are traditionally made with gluten. And he pretty much had to advocate really hard for himself to get a diagnosis. He was like, I know I don't feel well, and I know that when I don't eat gluten, I feel better. And so he initially got the diagnosis, but since he had done so much research before that, he understood that it was genetic, and so that myself and my siblings would need to get tested. So this was when I was probably in like elementary school. And so there is a blood test and a biopsy. So the blood test came back that I like had the genes for celiac disease. So then I went on and got the endoscopy. And so when they did the endoscopy, I didn't actually have any small intestinal damage at that time. So the doctor's recommendation was, well, celiac can, you could develop celiac in the future, but like you're not having any intestinal damage right now. So the recommendation was for me to continue eating gluten until I started having symptoms. So from when I was in elementary school till high school, I was eating gluten. My dad and my sister were eating gluten-free in our house. We did a split household. And I was like I said earlier, I was very resistant to going gluten-free. We had all these things in the house that were gluten-free for my dad and my sister. And I would try some of it and I was like, this is terrible. I was like, this is the worst. Like, I'm not going to eat this.
We've all had some pretty terrible gluten-free food before.
Yes. It's definitely getting so much better. But yeah, I was a lot pickier eater back then as well. But yeah, it was like, I was like, nope, I'll never do it. It's terrible. It's the worst. And then I started getting sick and I started feeling really terrible. And I was like, I know why and I know how to fix it. And so then I was about 17 and I was like, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep feeling this way when I know there's another way. And like, it was hard. And there were times, especially in the first couple of years, where I would cheat and have something that I knew I shouldn't have. But yeah, so then I was like 17, right before college, going away. But that's when I went gluten-free for good. And so that's been like 11 years now.
Wow, that is impressive. I don't have celiac, so very different situation, but I've gone through very long stretches without consuming it. And then I definitely have those moments where it's like, I'm having a bagel and I don't care. So it's that kind of defiance that you have, but there's obviously a much higher risk when you have the true celiac autoimmune condition because it can lead to malnourishment and all sorts of other things. So that's actually, as I'm saying that out loud, I don't ever want to make the assumption that someone knows that. Uh-huh. So if you do have celiac disease and you're consuming gluten, or say you have these other symptoms that you're not aware of and you don't know that you're having the intestinal reaction, what are some of the risks? And this isn't prescriptive telling anyone to just go off gluten, but what are, just for awareness and education, some of the risks you run, like what might occur if you do have that situation going on in your digestive tract and you're continuing to have gluten exposure?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the biggest one, like you said, is like malnourishment or malnutrition, as well as just different nutrient deficiencies. In your small intestines, you have the microvilli, and they are giving your small intestine more surface area. So when you have a response to gluten, that's kind of what is impacted is the microvilli, and they become flattened. And so you have less surface area in your intestines to absorb all the things you need. And so your small intestine is where you're getting most of your nutrients absorbed. So you also run the risk of having nutrient deficiencies and stuff like that. And also, like, even with the fact that there's over 300 diagnosed symptoms, there's also some people that will have what's called like a silent celiac. So they'll still be having intestinal damage, but they don't have any outwardly symptoms. And so those people will be like, oh, well, I don't feel bad, or like, I don't feel like I'm having any problems. And they can also like really run the risk of like, oh, well, I don't feel bad, so I can slip up every once in a while. And they're still having that intestinal damage. They just might not have some of those outwardly symptoms that they're noticing.
Very interesting. Thank you for explaining. So the microvilli, those are like, when you say add surface area, my very rudimentary visualization, because I'm a visual learner, those are kind of like the fingers, for lack of a better word, that come out from the intestinal wall. So you have that whole surface area rather than just the technical surface of the intestinal wall, correct?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. I'm just imagining little fingers floating. So I wanted to make sure I was understanding properly. I went to school for business and had a lot of communications education. Science is not my field, which is funny because I talk about it all the time. But it's I'm trying to relate it to people that are in my position where that's not what you're exposed to, and you're very much in like the business world, or other areas where you've gotten very far into your career, like you're going off on your own, which is incredible, and just aren't in that information all the time. So I appreciate you humoring me with confirming my visualization of the situation. So a question I have, which I alluded to a bit earlier, if you are, I would say 90% of females, and you might have had some struggle or continue to have some struggle with very restrictive dieting or things that put you in a very black and white mindset. With celiac, I realize it's kind of, you have to get there because you're going to cause harm. If you're gluten sensitive or you're just exploring whether you feel better without having that in your diet, do you have any recommendations or even any examples of methods you've used with clients or things that you've learned about in your education that kind of help navigate how to get to that point in a way that's not a negative mindset or something that puts you into a constant state of lack?
Yeah, of course. Well, if you are thinking, the biggest thing is I want to say that if you think you're having trouble with gluten for whatever reason, talking with your doctor and seeing if getting a celiac test would be helpful for you. So the one thing about the celiac testing is that you have to have gluten in your diet for it to show like a positive result, or like that you actually have celiac. Because if you have celiac and then you take the gluten out of your diet, then your microvilli are going to start healing. They're going to start looking more normal. And so you could possibly get like a false negative result saying that you don't actually have celiac, but you really do. So that would be my first thing, is like, if you think you're having a problem, go talk to your doctor. See if that might be something they could test you for. If anything, they could do the blood test first and then look at those results and then decide if an endoscopy was right for you. But yeah, if you've already done that, you're still kind of having some struggles with gluten, you think it might be something that you're not tolerating very well. I definitely think there are a lot of great options now. I think getting, your friends and your family on board and kind of educating them on why you're doing it. And then, continuing to have some of those more like quote unquote fun foods. There's a lot of different like Facebook groups or different support groups that are like, oh, well, just eat all naturally gluten-free foods like fruits and vegetables and meat and rice. And I'm like, that's fine. Like those should be in like a healthy dietary pattern, but you still want your sweets and your other fun foods that are maybe more energy or nutrient dense, or calorically dense, as opposed to maybe, like those micronutrient dense, having a lot of different, vitamins and minerals where you would get that from those fruits and vegetables. So I think just remembering that like everything isn't a dietary pattern, as opposed to like one food. Like eating one food isn't going to make or break your whole diet. Like you're not going to start becoming deficient in any of these vitamins and minerals just because you didn't eat fruits and vegetables one day. Like it's all a bigger picture than I think we get at when we do some of these restrictive dieting or counting calories or whatever it is. And the gluten-free diet, like you said, is already super restrictive in a lot of ways. And so to add restriction to that is going to be really challenging.
Speaking to the challenge, because you did mention a bit how you didn't directly say it, but kind of referenced social situations and things that are restrictive. Do you have any advice for if it's someone listening that is trying to go off of gluten for a variety of reasons, or if they have recently been diagnosed with celiac, or the one perspective I also want to keep in mind, if you are in the support network of someone who's going through that, how can you make that easier? Like, how can you kind of set yourself up for success so that you're not constantly triggered and feeling left out when you are not able to take part in something that in some way was probably a comfort or something that you use as part of celebrations like family holidays?
Yeah, I think, one thing I do a lot, especially when it's like potluck style, like I'm going to someone's house and we're having an event or like holiday, like bringing something that you know is safe for you, but also that you could share with other people. One of my biggest pet peeves is like media and different TV shows, they'll like put a bit about like how this gluten-free, like how all gluten-free food is disgusting or like whatever. Like, oh, we got the donuts, but they were out of the regular ones. So we got the gluten-free ones. And then everyone's like complaining about how terrible they are. So I like to share my gluten-free food when I can to just let people know that it's not all bad. There are some bad products. I will say that. There are some products that I really don't like, but everyone has their own personal preferences. But not all gluten-free food is bad. So I think, bringing your own food at times can be helpful. I don't always love bringing your own food because cooking at times can be exhausting. You don't want to have to cook all the time. And just being open with those people that are in your life and want to be there and want to support you. If you're going out to a restaurant, being like, oh, well, this restaurant doesn't have a menu option for me. Can we try this one instead? So there are a lot of different ways, but social support really is going to be super, super helpful in like being able to sustain this because it can be challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like if you were to be diagnosed or to go down this path now, it's still extremely challenging. But I know friends who had to go through this many years ago when not everything had a gluten-free option. So anytime I would express frustration, they were like, look, I'm here for you. But seriously, you have no idea what it was like in like 1998 to not be able to have gluten. So the one benefit I would say of it being a trend in the wellness space, I use the hashtag wellness space because I think there's great things out there, but there's also a lot of predatory, icky things out there. But one of the good things that's come out of gluten-free being a trend in that regard is that there is more availability. Mm-hmm. I was in New York City last week. I'm there fairly often and went out to a restaurant in Little Italy with my husband thinking, oh, I'm not going to be able to get anything. And every single place had a gluten-free pasta option. So that was definitely not the case maybe even a decade ago. So that's something that certainly made it more accessible. The downside is you sometimes get this social backlash, for lack of a better word, where if you say gluten-free, you get the eye roll and you get the really, okay, you too. Mm-hmm. And granted, people can say that and they can think what they want and I shouldn't let it get to me, but I'm a human being. So you kind of fall into this kind of people-pleasing self-defense at the same time type of posture where you say like, no, I actually have this health concern and this is why. And I catch myself over explaining. Sometimes I'll be like, I'm not eating gluten. I'm not allergic, but I'm trying it for health reasons. Do you have any advice or even in your own experience? Because I feel like that's probably one of the reasons that clients respond so well to you is that you can relate to them. You're not preaching from a place where you don't have the experience and haven't been in their shoes. Do you have any advice on how to kind of get over that hump?
Oh, that's a good question. Cause yeah, I feel the same way. It's like, I look a certain way, like I'm a young woman, like I'm just, following the trend because it's what the celebrities do. I just have to remember that they don't, have to know everything. And like, at the end of the day, it is my health and like, I'm going to advocate for that. And if they're not going to do the things that I need them to, or I'm asking them to in a restaurant setting or whatever, I have the power to leave. Like there are a couple times that I can remember of like oh, well, I was at a restaurant and they weren't hearing me, and like they didn't have the right answers to the questions, like, or like they didn't know at all anything. And I was like, okay, well, like this isn't my place. And like that's okay too. Like advocating for yourself and your health, at least to me, is like really important. And so like you have to decide how important that is to you. And if you want to advocate, or if, you know, I mean, leaving the restaurant and not giving them your money is advocating too. And so
That is true.
um, so yeah, it is definitely hard. I think, you know, just practicing too, like if you do these things all the time, like they're just going to become second nature. And like, you just have to let go of some of those things where you like think people have their certain perceptions of you, because they likely do, but they don't matter.
No, absolutely. One question, changing gears a little bit here, that I'm curious about because I was recently in Europe and had this experience. So I know that if you have celiac, it's a no wheat. It doesn't matter where the wheat comes from. It doesn't matter what type it is or if it's been genetically modified or any of that. But I have noticed, as someone who has gluten sensitivity and it impacts my energy levels, that's the most obvious symptom I notice. I did notice that when I had pasta in Italy, that I didn't have the same kind of lull as I have in America. And I kind of explored that a little bit. Now, Google can be the greatest tool and also just your worst nightmare whenever you're looking up things like that. And I'm pretty mindful. I've had an autoimmune condition since I was a kid. So I'm very mindful of looking for PubMed articles and things that have links to actual source documentation and where they've gotten these studies, et cetera. But when I Googled, it seems like that's a fairly common occurrence of people who tend to have a little bit of a gluten sensitivity, definitely not celiac. So I just want to stress that. When they were eating different variations with, I believe it said there might be a lower gluten content, or maybe it's just because they use like the einkorn wheat or something that's more of an ancient grain. Is there any validity to that in your research? Because obviously you have the actual credentials as a dietitian. And I was just really curious because that's something that I very recently looked into, and I would love to get your perspective if you have one on that.
Yeah. So like you said, not safe for celiacs. And so because most of the people, like I want to work with our celiac, I haven't looked into it that much. And my understanding, like I think that the gluten would be the same. Like the gluten's always going to be the same. And we have to remind everyone that gluten is also in barley and rye, if you're listening. But yeah, so it comes up in like all these different support groups, like, oh my gosh, you can have gluten in Italy or like in Europe. And like, that's just, for people with celiac, that's not true. Please don't go eat
I wasn't trying to open the door for that, I promise.
No, of course. Also, as someone who has traveled to Italy a couple times while being gluten-free, they have some really awesome gluten-free options. But yeah, so I haven't dove too much into the research just because most of the people I plan to work with or want to work with are going to be celiac. And so that's never going to be a recommendation for them. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to look into. I think more than likely it would just be that, like you said, the lower gluten content for people that may have sensitivities. But like the gluten protein itself wouldn't like have a different structure or anything like that. As far as I know.
Yeah. So switching away from that, this is me also probably just justifying that I ate pasta when I was in Europe. I was actually in Spain, but also had it in Italy last time I was there. I would love to hear, so if someone just got diagnosed and they know that they need to get rid of gluten in their diet, like it's a non-negotiable if you truly have celiac. Mm-hmm. But the thought of doing it in one giant step, the next day never eating it again, have you ever had to work with or done studies around patients who say, okay, I know I need to get rid of it. Can you help me come up with a plan on how to do this step by step till I get to a point in a healthy manner of time? Obviously, you don't want to drag it out too long for their health, but to get to a point where I can truly eliminate this and feel comfortable with it and feel like I have the confidence to go into a social setting and advocate for myself with the way we were just talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't started working with clients one-on-one quite yet. But I do know that a lot of people, if they get a referral to a dietitian, which is a big if, because not everyone, despite celiac disease being only a diet related like diagnosis, like there aren't any other treatment options. It's a big if people actually get a referral to a dietitian.
That's a whole other conversation that
Yeah.
we could have. But yeah.
So
anyone who's out there trying to find your diagnosis for anything, know that you have to advocate for yourself if you want to get a diet consult or any other type of lifestyle consult or anything of that nature. So that's a total, I could go off about that for an hour, but.
But so a lot of people, like once they do finally get to a dietitian, they've done a lot of like their own like Google research and have been maybe taking some of this stuff out. And then they just will likely need a little more support and like some of those things that they are kind of hidden gluten, things like sauces and
soy sauce. That was one I didn't know. I miss soy sauce, but there's coconut aminos, so there's a 1-to-1, which is great.
Yeah, the tamari is really great, and there are some gluten-free soy sauce brands as well. So I think a lot of people, by the time they get to see a dietitian, they've done some of their own like internet research, which is good and bad, right? You shouldn't have to get all of your health advice from the internet, and there's a lot of unreliable people or people fear mongering in those spaces. But I think a lot of people have already, tried to make some of those changes and, start buying some of the gluten-free products as their alternatives. But yeah, it can take some time, and like, you're not going to get it right when you first start. Like, you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And like, just try not to be so hard on yourself when you're doing it. It'll take you a long time, or it could take you a long time to find those alternatives that you really like and enjoy. But over time, your taste buds do kind of change and you get used to some of these things. Like the fact that gluten-free food just falls apart. Like you'll get used to it at some point. And it's just kind of the nature of the food, unfortunately. But yeah, it will take some time. And like I said, if it does take some time, yes, there will be damage, but like you're probably going to do less damage than if you don't take it out at all.
Very solid point. Do you have any, if someone is early on in their exploration, like I now know certain brands that I like and certain recipes to follow. There's a lot of gluten-free bread that I don't eat bread really because the substitutes are not something I enjoy. I found tortillas that I like. The Siete ones are the ones I like the best. They still fall apart a little bit, but they hold it better than some of the ones I've had where as soon as I roll it, everything just explodes on my plate, and I might as well have gone the bowl option. But are there any like cookbooks or resources or anything out there that you find are particularly helpful if someone's like, I'm really struggling and I need to find, if this is again specific to someone who cooks, but if someone's like, I need to find a resource for things that actually taste similar to, or at least provide me with a tasty option that doesn't have the ingredient that I obviously can't have anymore.
Yeah. There are a lot of great cookbooks. Now you asked me and I'm like, now I can't remember what the one I have is. Oh my goodness. But there's some really great cookbooks. There are a lot of different recipes on like some of the different brands. They'll have a lot of different recipes. My biggest thing is I don't like when I have to make a recipe and I have to get like 500 different flours. Like I'm always going to do the 1-to-1 flour, and that's just
I do the same thing.
Yeah, like I don't have shelf space to get like an almond flour and an oat flour and all these different flours, and like I just don't need that. Like all these
for like basic cooking, I'll use just an almond flour. But if I'm baking, where you need to really have something that is chemically going to respond the same way as flour, that's when I do the 1-to-1. So yeah, if anyone's listening and you're into baking, do not try to figure that out on your own. It will be a disaster. I have not ruined because obviously I cleaned it, but I caused a very unfortunate incident in my oven on more than one occasion, or something came out just tasting like a dense brick that fell apart in my hands. So it's definitely It's a fun, at times frustrating exploration to find what works for you when you're baking and
Yes,
cooking.
it can be for sure. And then there are just some different like influencers or dietitians that I follow that have like really good like logs of different recipes that they will like categorize by different diets. One of them is like hummus sapien and goodness. Now I can't remember all the.
Oh, you're fine. I can also get them from you later and put them in the show notes.
Okay, yeah, I'll
No
let
worries.
you link them.
Yeah. And one thing I always stress on here, and I've had several guests on here, Dana Munzi specifically, who has very much preached this. Just like if you're following someone and it's someone you've gotten resources from and they're great, but then they might post things that might be a little triggering for you or something that seems a little too restrictive, or audit your social media. So you're always going to find new people and new things and stuff that's put out there. And if you're like, I really like this person's recipes, but then the other stuff they post drives me insane, maybe just check on their account once in a while and save the recipes. Don't make that part of your feed every single day. When I decided to go gluten-free again for my thyroid, I had to unfollow. I like to watch people when if I just am really stressed because I have a pretty demanding full-time job. I'll watch people when they're like baking, or they'll put up those really cool videos. And I followed someone who baked pretty often. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to watch this for a little while. I just can't. It's going to make me really want to get a non-gluten-free cake. And that's not done from like a place of restriction. That's done from like, I'm going to be kind to myself right now while I'm making this adjustment. So that's something I always recommend for anyone to do. So I will get those from you, like who you recommend. And I'll make sure that I share those in the show notes. And the cookbook I was thinking about when we started talking is Against All Grain by Danielle Walker. So that's one. I don't know if you've ever used that one, but she was one that I really enjoyed. She has, I might misspeak, so I can correct myself later, but I believe it's either Crohn's or colitis. Okay. And so she had to go through some pretty drastic changes to her diet. And she put together several cookbooks that just naturally don't have a lot of the ingredients that cause problems for women with autoimmune conditions, especially those that impact our GI tract. And that was one I loved because it was actually just like step by step, everything written out for me. And it wasn't like The Joy of Cooking where you need to spend 8 hours prepping for whatever meal you're going to make. It was very reasonable. Yeah. So that was one I know I enjoyed. So I think for me, I had to kind of make it a little bit of a project. Like, let me try these different things and experiment with these things. And there's times when you work full time that is hard. So I've learned what I do need to do is kind of do a little bit of preparations and have the options that don't have the gluten available, so that's not an easy thing to grab and not an easy thing to kind of fall back on when ultimately my goal is to help my body heal. It's not to take things away, but it's just like doing what I can to help my body heal. So when you said you haven't worked with many clients yet, so you've been going through obviously the education process and you've started kind of sharing what your mission is out there. So I would love to hear more about like what you're planning to do with this gluten focused dietitian work.
Yeah. So like I said earlier, a lot of people don't get referred to a dietitian when they get a diagnosis. And if they do, they get referred to a dietitian that doesn't have a specialty in celiac or gluten-related disorders, which is fine. Like, obviously, I'm very much for, getting your education and your certification, but a lot of dietitians in the outpatient space are going to be just generalized, and they may not have a lot of this information, like the hidden gluten or the questions you need to ask when you go out to a restaurant, or like any of these just like understanding of like what the social situation might look like and how it can be really isolating or frustrating to go and like not be able to eat when your family has a holiday, or like having to provide all of your own food. And so I want to work with people, both one-on-one, but then just offer education as well, to just support people, and so that they don't have to feel all of these negative emotions, or that they're being overly restricted because of their diet, or that they have to choose their health or any, whatever else it is that they have to choose their health or their career, and so I want people to be thriving with their diagnosis and not feeling like they're just surviving. And I want people to be able to like live their life and just, it is a part of your day-to-day life for the rest of forever, at least for now. But it doesn't have to control every thought and every second of your day. It is hard because food is so important to so many things and so many different situations. And so I just want to support people to help them understand, what gluten is and like how it impacts their body. And like, then they can make those educated decisions about what makes sense for them. And if, how strict they want to be. Obviously, I'm going to tell them that they should be strict, but everyone's health is their own and they have, bodily autonomy and all of these things. And so I just want to offer education. So I do have a course that I've put out in the world. And it's just going over some of those things like, what is gluten? Where do you find it? What does this diagnosis even mean? And some of those kind of like basic, like overarching themes and important information that people with this diagnosis need to know. And then I'm working on getting set up to work with people that maybe have some of this knowledge or education, but they're still struggling. They're still having those symptoms. They're trying to figure out where they may be exposed to gluten because they feel like they're super strict and, all of these things.
No, that's wonderful. And where can listeners find that? And also on top of that, how can they work with you if what you're sharing is really resonating?
Yeah. So I have my website is glutenfreedomnutrition.com. So on there, it has a link to the course I have for sale right now. And then I'm on Instagram at Gluten Freedom Nutrition. And then I also have a personal Instagram, Alexa Prass RDN. So it's more sharing just different things from my life. Because like I shared earlier, I've traveled, like I went to college. I don't think your diagnosis has to stop you from any of these things. You just have to have the right mindset about it. And so I want to share myself doing some of these, fun things that are at work.
Going to Italy.
Yeah. And going to Italy. And just to show that these things are possible. They likely look a lot different than maybe you thought they would have, or how they would have if you didn't have this diagnosis, but they're still very much possible. So yeah, I share more of that kind of stuff on that platform. And yeah, those are kind of the ways you can find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming. I also appreciate that you want to empower patients, especially women, to seek out the diet consult, especially if you're diagnosed with a condition that purely affects your GI tract. And that's where the majority of the symptoms are presenting. Like you said, there are 300 different types of symptoms, but obviously a lot of the common ones we know and the ones that are going to be the most obvious are the ones that have to do with your digestion. So it's important to me on the platform to educate and empower women to really start knowing not only do they have the right, but they really need to self-advocate for themselves in medical settings and ask those questions and ask for those referrals, or at least have the knowledge that they can look for someone to work with on their own if it's not presented to them, which unfortunately is probably going to be what happens for a little while. But we're all out here trying to advocate and change that. So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And obviously, anyone listening, please check Alexa out. And I will provide all of the information she shared with her website and her social media handles.
Well, thank you for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Invisibly Unwell. If you like the show, I'd greatly appreciate if you followed it, and if you left a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is that you're listening. This allows me to keep the show going and to continue to bring on incredible guests to share their stories.